Okay, so just a quick explanation of some additional things about distrust of government here. So, in addition to the Watergate scandal, which really increased the Americans' distrust of the government, the Vietnam War also played a significant role here. So, some of the things that were happening in the early 1970s, you have the secret bombing of Cambodia by Richard Nixon, where that was kept secret from Congress and the American public against Congress's explicit instructions about the war in Vietnam. This was seen as an expansion of the war, and people, because of the opposition to the war, there was not any public support for expanding the war. So bombing Cambodia and overthrowing the government, it seemed like an overreach by the president and extending his power beyond what he should be doing. In addition, you have the anti-war protests at Kent State, where the National Guard killed 4 college students who were protesting the Vietnam War and wounded 9 others. This was seen as the government being kind of brutal towards anti-war protesters. And it was kind of highlighted the difference between people who were opposed to the war and what the government was doing. And then in Vietnam, we have the My Lai massacre, which occurred in 1968. But then 3 years later, you had the officer who was in charge of the U.S. soldiers that were responsible for the My Lai massacre was convicted of murder, basically. And the My Lai massacre was the killing of 300 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, including women and children. So this kind of highlighted the brutality of the Vietnam War, and also that the war was unjust, and that was not how America kind of saw itself, as killing kids and unarmed women, right? And then, the Pentagon Papers is a crucial event here because these were secret papers that were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. He basically snuck them out of an office and got them published in the New York Times. And these Pentagon Papers show that the government knew that the war in Vietnam was not winnable as far back as the early 1960s. So in other words, for the whole time the Vietnam War was happening, the U.S. government had a pretty good idea that there was no way to really win that war. And this really infuriated a lot of people because they were saying that, how can we send young Americans to die in this war when we know it's not winnable? Seems like a waste of American lives. And so Congress was upset about this. And so they repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which, if you remember, expanded the war in Vietnam. And they replaced it with the War Powers Act, which was basically, it took back some of that power back that they gave to the president, saying the president could still send in troops, but he had to notify Congress, and Congress would have to reauthorize and give permission for a continued use of that force. So this was a way for Congress to kind of pull back some of the power that they'd given to the president of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as kind of a slap on their wrist to say, like, hey, you went too far with this stuff. And then, this distrust of government, I mentioned in the other screencast about the Watergate scandal and how that really kind of decreased Americans' distrust in government. So in this period from in the early 1970s, there were several events, either with the Vietnam War or with Watergate, that really showed Americans were unhappy with their government and didn't feel they could be trusted.